Some of this stuff would probably be cool to hear in concert. Maybe one of those 8-bit bands out there could try a remix? Great stuff, in any case. And when you beat the game on normal, you get a password to start up a sound test. Very cool. Now, the sound and graphics are nice, but the gameplay is the most important part. As I said earlier, Battle Kid is a single-screen action platformer with a very high difficulty level. Basically, you progress along, exploring new areas. There are enemies you have to fight and kill, a quite large variety in fact, but the major challenge is not fighting a bunch of enemies. Rather, it is simply figuring out how to get to the next screen while avoiding extremely hazardous environmental conditions. You'll have bouncing balls, which kill you. Spikes to jump over, which kill you. A fan that blows you into a pit, which kills you. Strategically placed enemies will jump out and kill you. Basically, you get killed a lot. Which is fine. After all, eventually you figure out what to do, and this is often pretty satisfying. Because of the extreme difficulty and the very specific nature of how you must progress through each area, the game is actually more of an action puzzle game than anything. I am somewhat reminded of Solomon's Key because of this. As you progress through these very difficult areas, every so often you'll find an area you can't get through yet. This is where the game takes a clue from Metroid, and you must find upgrades to get to these new areas. For example, you find an item that lets you jump higher in order to jump a large gap, or an upgrade to your blaster to destroy certain blocks. While the game appears pretty open at first, because of this restriction the path you take is actually pretty linear. About the only exception is once you've beaten the boss of an area and gotten some new upgrade, you have to figure out how to get back. You can often take a couple different ways back, or even take a warp zone like this. Also, there's a hidden item and hidden area late in the game. Also of note, if you can't remember or can't find the entrance to the next unexplored area, there's a well-constructed hint system via a terminal at the very beginning of the game. Rarely needed, but a very good idea to help avoid endless, frustrating backtracking. So basically, you progress in linear fashion, and every major new area has its own boss. The bosses are rather spectacular, and quite a challenge as well. Most of them are frustrating, but it's a rewarding kind of frustrating. This is greatly helped by save areas immediately before each and every boss, so you die and die and die and die, but over time you find yourself living longer and longer, until you win. Or give up and smash the cartridge with a hammer. Your choice. Personally, I felt the third boss was obnoxiously difficult and pushed the limit of what I find acceptable in a game. But the final boss was the only one that truly goes too far. I won't go into detail as the game is still new and I don't want to spoil it, but the final boss simply has too much health. You can get an upgrade to double your weapon damage, but it is hidden and I never found it. With it, I suspect I would have still found the final boss very frustrating, but within reason. As is, I came close to giving up, but after over 2 hours, finally beat him. One thing about the weapon upgrade, it's tough to find, and, because of that, tough to get. So, to get it, you have to be really good. This, to me, is the ultimate catch-22 in game design, making it very difficult to get an item that makes the game easier. Yeah, if you play on easy mode, the game starts you off with this item, but that would have made every other boss in the game a relative cakewalk. The major point here being, I found the other bosses frustrating, but fun. The final boss I found extremely frustrating and not fun. If it sounds like I'm harping on the difficulty, well, sorry, but that's a huge aspect of the game. This game is tough. At times, I found it got a little too frustrating even outside of the bosses. As another example, there's this rather stunning area where you have to get through a spike maze. This was very challenging and long. Fine. My problem was the next area, where you're literally dropped into a room with 2 enemies and barely have time to react before you get shot and die. It's one of a relative handful of moments where I felt the design of the game was being cheap. This is opposed to the game's progenitor, I Wanna Be the Guy, where the game being cheap is the entire point. The general fairness in design throughout Battle Kid makes these occasional sore points really stick out in an otherwise quite good game. A big part of the reason the game doesn't feel cheap are the controls. They're precise. Very precise. There are times where you have to jump a pretty exact height, and if you hold jump too long, you'll die. So obviously, controls have to be just right in order for the game to be even playable. In general, the controls are superb. Everything is predictable, the double jump mechanic is excellent, and the item that lets you slow down while falling works great. My only real complaint about the controls is, in fact, their very precise nature. There are times where you have to very slowly edge forward to give yourself the maximum amount of time to get past an enemy or obstacle. Well, in games like Mega Man, there's a slight bit of momentum in starting and stopping, which makes it easier to edge forward. Battle Kid doesn't have this, it's all or nothing with every action. For the most part, that's a good thing, but occasionally, like this moment where you have to fall down without walking too far forward, it makes for a death that feels a little unfair. The nature of the controls reminds me of another area, hit detection. It is also extremely precise, perhaps too precise. In platformers, there is an area where the graphical sprite representing your character resides, and then there's an area where you'll actually be hurt if you collide with an enemy, called a hitbox. In many games, these areas are not exactly the same size. In general, the hitbox is usually a bit smaller than your sprite, allowing for a little give and take when avoiding enemies and their attacks. Pay attention the next time you play Super Mario Bros., for instance, and you'll quickly notice stuff like your feet passing through enemies that should have hit you, a fireball passing through Mario's head, and so on. Battle Kid is not like this. If the tiniest bit of any enemy or projectile touches a single pixel on Timmy's foot, he dies. Is this a bad thing? Some won't mind it in the slightest, and it isn't really unfair, but I'd have preferred more leeway. Just a preference, not a giant area of concern or anything. Okay then, I've discussed the graphics, control, sound, design, and gameplay. What's left? Well, a major one for NES games, and for people considering paying over $30 for one at that, is probably the length and possible replayability. On that end, I'm happy to report that the game is actually of considerable length. It took me over 12 hours to beat it. Granted, a lot of this time was due to my many deaths, but even a very good first playthrough would likely exceed 6 hours. Exceptional players could probably do it in the 90-minute to 2-hour range after numerous playthroughs. In any case, all of these are great numbers for a 2D platformer. For comparison, Mega Man 2, considered a pinnacle of the NES library, is pretty easy to beat in under an hour. There is, thankfully, a rather excellent save and password system to start again where you left off. It's not too long and the font is clear. I had no incorrectly written down passwords, a problem I've experienced on some other NES titles I've played. As far as replayability, there are higher difficulties, which eliminate the passwords and limit lives. I could see myself trying to beat it again on one of these difficulty settings at some much later date, but only after I can beat the game rather routinely on normal and know where the weapons upgrade is. As of now, though, I need a long break from Battle Kid's many frustrating moments. So, taken as a whole, Battle Kid is a very well-constructed game with excellent controls, nice and colorful graphics, and great music. It's also very difficult and frustrating, and at times this makes the game feel less like fun entertainment and more like a chore. Regardless, it's a high-quality product and a very impressive one considering it was mostly made by a single person. So, props to Sivak on his game-making mojo. Hope I got your name right. Rather than giving the game a number rating, it might be better to stack Battle Kid up against the NES library. Looking again at this sample of my NES collection, ranked from the top-end classics down to the garbage, Battle Kid ends up around this point. No, it doesn't quite top Super Mario Bros. 3, Battletoads, or The Legend of Zelda, but to me, it does make it up there with some near classics like Journey to Silius, Mendel Palace, Metal Storm, or maybe even Star Tropics. Beyond this simple way of ranking it, the game's ending makes it clear a sequel is possible. If that becomes a reality, I'll be first in line.